Hello, my name is Breza, and I'll be talking about how to rethink your how-tos so that you can move from just writing instructions to solving real-world user problems. I'm also going to show you how you can stop your how-to instructions from ever breaking on a customer again. Yes, before you ask, even UI instructions. But you'll have to stick around to the end of this talk to hear about that. But before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about what you can get out of this talk. After this talk, you'll have a strategy to evaluate your existing how-to documentation, our exact formula for crafting how-tos using the every page is page one methodology, and how-tos that won't break on your users ever again. Maybe this sounds too good to be true, so let me tell you a little bit about our team and how we approach this. Here at Kong, our docs team consists of 6 writers and 1 docs tooling engineer. Kong has 12 different products, apps, and tools. All writers on our team write for all products. As you can see from the diagram, our products, apps, and tools have increasingly been working together in one unified API platform and ecosystem. Because our documentation was separated by product, it became harder and harder for both us and customers to explain the connections between products. But this wasn't our only pain point. Although we were experiencing pain with writing our docs, we noticed users were having a hard time too. From the user feedback, we learned there were 2 main problems. The first problem was that users couldn't find the docs they were looking for. When users would search for a topic, oftentimes the most related content wouldn't be shown first. If they tried to manually search for the content, our docs were layered 3 or 4 times deep, which made it hard to find the exact page. And if they did find the right doc, many of them didn't work. For example, when a user would find the right page, they'd try to run the examples, but then the examples wouldn't work, or the reference content on the page would be out of date. As these same pain points kept coming up in docs requests, we knew we had to do some investigating to come up with a solution. One thing we knew for certain was that existing documentation was untested and out of date. Many docs were originally written by developers, so they were old and untested. We kept getting feedback that docs weren't up to date or they didn't run as expected. As a small team that was just barely keeping up with release docs, we didn't have the time or resources needed to go back to old documentation and update them. Additionally, we didn't have a good system in place for users to provide feedback on docs. We wanted to provide an AI chatbot on our docs, but during testing, its answers were inaccurate most of the time because the source material in our docs was out of date. As we looked into the specific docs users were saying were broken, we discovered that examples couldn't be easily copy-pasted by users. Our users are very technical. When they are trying to configure something, they like examples they can directly copy, paste, and run end-to-end. Our existing docs didn't support this because they use placeholder values inconsistently, and often running the example with the placeholder would cause it to fail. Additionally, content often assumed that users knew certain general prerequisites. We didn't list these prerequisites, which frustrated new users. Many how-to guides specifically were too generic or tried to provide all possible options on one page. They weren't opinionated enough, so in the end, they were unhelpful to users. For example, on our HashiCorp Vault how-to, we showed all the possible ways you could configure a vault, but didn't provide any information about how HashiCorp needed to be configured, and the placeholder values weren't descriptive enough. The next thing we found in our investigation was that information was scattered and couldn't be found easily via search. The reason it was hard for users to find information was because we'd often have several different pages that all related to one concept, but they were located in different places. Furthermore, customer searches also weren't showing the correct page because they were based solely on keywords and not metadata. So now that we knew what the specific things were that were causing users to report broken docs, We needed to come up with a strategy to evaluate our docs and fix them. But with 1,000+ pages of documentation, how did we know where to start? We started with a thought experiment. Throw out your docs. That sounds scary, but also freeing? Just think, if you threw out your docs, where would you start? What type of docs would you write first? What would you do differently if you could just start from scratch? Just to clarify, we didn't actually throw away our docs. We just wanted to see what we could come up with if we had a clean slate. It started with rethinking our content types. We were using the diataxis framework, which if you don't know what that means, it means we specifically wrote 4 types of guides. How-tos that were action-oriented, guiding a user to complete a task. Tutorials that were geared towards learning and getting started. Explanation guides that explained concepts to help users understand how something worked. And finally, reference guides for configurations, APIs, and plugin parameters that users could consult for information. The diataxis framework clearly works well, but in our case, we noticed the separation in our tutorials and how-tos was hurting users instead of helping them. Let me explain. I mentioned previously that our users are very technical. Sometimes it was too easy to assume that they knew everything or that they've already had this product or feature set up before they attempted an advanced configuration. This wasn't always the case. Or a new user would land on a page and would get stuck because they didn't have the assumed prerequisites. We knew we wanted to combine how-tos and tutorials into one doc type, the new how-to guides. This way, users knew they could rely on how-to guides to show them step-by-step how to complete a task, no matter if they were advanced or a beginner. So we knew we wanted one type of guide, but how did we decide what content to put on the page? Before we decided what to do ourselves, we looked to other doc sites. We created a board with pages from docs we admired. Then we all left comments. What did these docs do well? What would we change? As we explored other guides, a few things jumped out at us. For our users, concrete, opinionated use case guides were the most valuable. Just to illustrate this point, we have one plugin, the OpenID Connect plugin, that has at least 25 different ways it can be configured depending on the use case. While this isn't an extreme case, many of our users use features in different ways, and they feel frustrated when they find a guide that's too generic and isn't specific to their use case. The next thing we noticed was that the best how-to docs contained all the information a user needed on one page. Even though how-to guides are action-oriented, sometimes the prerequisites in our guides were just links to other pages, or concepts weren't explained. If every page is page 1, users shouldn't have to go to a different page to understand something or to complete a prerequisite. Here we decided some of our first guiding principles. A user with nothing set up should land on a how-to or tutorial and be able to complete it. And since a page might be completed by an advanced user as well as a beginner, we knew we needed to provide the right amount of information for both users. So we have our guiding principles. Where did we go from here? Using the information from our exploration of how-tos on other doc sites, we started to come up with a template for what our how-to would look like. We went through a few rounds of discussing the format, but eventually we landed on the core parts we wanted in our how-to guides. Each guide would have a prerequisites section that contained all the steps necessary to run from zero to a working use case. When the tutorial used a tool like our declarative config tool, API, or Terraform, each step would contain a code snippet that could be run. This allows users to just copy and paste their way down the page. To ensure every page is page 1, each how-to would contain a description of what was happening in the steps as well. Additionally, FAQ and troubleshooting that related to the guide would be on the same page instead of a different page. But there was one more section in the template that radically changed our how-tos. It was a final validation step. We decided that if the goal was for the user to copy and paste on the page, they needed a way to confirm from an output that they set up everything correctly. Also, this would allow any manual test to confirm that the doc and product are working as expected. This also includes automated tests, but more on that later. For now, we had a template that we needed to put to the test. The template worked great in theory, but how would it work in practice? We put our ideas to the stress test by breaking up into small groups with the same task. Write a guide that uses our template that's about a common use case, rate limiting a service. Each group wrote their own version of the how-to guide following the template. Then we came together to discuss any sticking points. And the good news was that our template worked. Now to test it on the rest of our docs. And by test, I really mean test. Remember how I said that we had a lot of old docs that hadn't been tested in a while, and how we added a required validation step to our template? Well, now the writers needed to go through each doc and manually test them. Maybe this is controversial, but it needs to be said before we move on. Technical writers need to be testing the products. I'm going to say it again because this is really important. Technical writers need to be testing the products. You can have all the fancy docs design and formatting in the world, but if you aren't testing the products and docs, you're going to have frustrated users. If there's only one thing you take from this talk, I hope it's this. If this seems daunting, it's because it definitely is. I'm not going to lie, this was a huge fundamental shift on our team. Previously, we had semi-tested docs, but never from complete scratch. Sure, we tested an odd endpoint or verified that the field names were accurate in the UI, but for the first time, we were going to be put in our users' shoes. We were going to have to test things from scratch and end to end, just like they did. But maybe I haven't convinced you that writers need to test the products. So let me share this small anecdote from a testing experience I had while we were rethinking our how-tos. I was tasked with testing and reworking our Google Cloud Vault content. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, our previous Vault docs contained too many ways to do the same thing. Also, since I had never tested Google Cloud or Vaults before, I truly was starting from scratch. As I tried to test from scratch, I realized the existing doc told me nothing about how to configure Google Cloud if it wasn't already set up. Essentially, I spent hours scouring the internet and used the help of AI to get this set up. I remember how frustrated I was thinking that I set up everything correctly, but it still didn't seem to work. It was then that I realized if I was struggling to figure this out from our existing docs, so were users. How frustrated I felt was how frustrated they felt. And if I'd never had to test everything from scratch, including third-party products, I never truly would have realized our users' pain. Now, hopefully I've convinced you to test your products and docs end to end. But maybe you're wondering how you can test, especially third-party products, when budgets and access are restricted. My answer is do the best you can. Test what you can, it's better than not testing at all. Many third-party products offer free trials. Talk to your PMs and devs who are testing this as part of their development process and see if you can use one of their accounts. Think of it this way. If no one is testing the docs, there's a good chance they're going to be wrong at some point. If a customer can't run the doc as expected, they're going to get frustrated. If they get frustrated enough, they'll churn and leave for a different product. It might be cheaper for your org to get the license for testing than for them to lose potentially thousands because of customer churn. So, now that we'd be manually testing the docs, it was time to write them up using our how-to template from earlier. In this section, I'm going to go through the details of how we write our how-tos so that you can use what works for your situation. But first, I'm actually going to do a demo where I run through a how-to to show you how it truly allows users to copy and paste on the page and achieve their goal. In this how-to, I'll be setting up a Kong gateway vault and using HashiCorp to store a secret. I'm starting from scratch, like a user might. First, I copy, paste, and run the Kong gateway install steps in the prerequisites. This starts our product, Kong Gateway, in Docker, in case the user doesn't have it installed yet. A user could skip this step if they're already got Kong Gateway running. Next, I need to use our declarative configuration tool for this how-to. I've already got it installed, so I check to make sure I'm using the supported version. For the third prerequisite, we need to start HashiCorp Vault and store a secret. I've already got it installed, so I can skip the install link. I copy and run the command to start a vault in dev. Notice how we've even provided step-by-step instruction for a third-party product. This allows users to run all the steps to start a HashiCorp Vault and store their secret without ever having to leave the page. To finish my HashiCorp setup, I verify that my vault is running correctly, authenticate with the vault, and then validate that I'm using the correct secrets engine. Imagine how much time it would take a user to find all these third-party steps on their own, and how many different browser tabs they'd have. Now we're in the main steps of the how-to. See how I can still copy and paste my way down the page? This is the exact way our users want to interact with the docs. I'm running the steps to store the secret, which is Acme Inc., and configure my Kong Gateway Vault. At the end, I verify that my configuration worked and Kong is able to retrieve the secret I've stored in HashiCorp Vault. By running the validation step, I confirm that my output, Acme Inc., matches what the how-to says my output should be. So that went pretty fast, which is great for users. But maybe you've got some questions about how we made that how-to. Let's do a deep dive into the things you saw in the demo and really deconstruct how we make those how-tos at Kong. Our how-to formula has 7 main sections to it: the title, the TLDR, prerequisites, third-party prerequisites, the steps, FAQs, and finally, the validation step. An oldie but goodie, the how-to title. Many frameworks recommend using gerunds, verbs with ing endings, but you can see here we've opted not to do that. Why? Well, remember how hard it was for users to find the content they were looking for before? We chose to write titles that match what a user would search for, and they typically don't search by a gerund. Also, we chose to use more descriptive verbs like store and rotate instead of configure when possible to further increase findability. Be sure to use the use case keywords that users will search by in your titles as well. I mentioned before how we have very advanced users and beginners alike. The TLDR section is how we meet the needs of both users. For advanced users, we write the TLDR in a way that they could read it and know exactly how to complete the task without even looking at the rest of the how-to. For all users, the TLDR also acts as an overview for what this how-to will guide them through. The next essential section is the prerequisites. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with what this section typically looks like, so I'll just explain what makes ours different. Our prerequisites assume you don't have anything installed and you are starting from scratch. This helps us ensure all users are successful. Instead of linking to other docs for users to complete the prerequisites, we provide all instructions in line. Also, this applies to third-party docs. Remember my Google Cloud Vault story from earlier? If we had written up the third-party steps in the doc, I never would have struggled for hours. Also, we provide the exact third-party steps in line. Here's another third-party example we have, this time for the UI. We provide the link to the Amazon docs if users want to follow them, but rather than provide several links to other docs, we write both the UI and CLI instructions on the page so users can choose the method that works for them, especially since this configuration is essential for AWS to work with our product. I'm sure you're wondering about the third-party products changing and breaking the docs workflow, so stick around to the end and I'll show you how we make sure that never happens. For each step in the how-to, we provide a description so users know what they're doing to help them learn. But some users just want to complete their task, so we make it easy by providing an example they can copy, paste, and run. All variables are set in the how-to, so as long as someone copy and paste each step, they'll complete the guide successfully. One of the last sections we have in our guide is the FAQ section. The FAQ section provides several benefits. First of all, they use commonly searched keywords and phrasing in the questions part. So if a user searches with those keywords, search will find the page easier. Second, they serve just as an FAQ and answer questions that a user might have about the topic, so they don't have to go to a separate page. And finally, they also provide troubleshooting answers and steps. So if a user encounters a problem while they are running the how-to, the answer is right there on the same page. I mentioned before that all our how-tos contain a validate step. Each validate step contains two parts: the code snippet and the expected output a user would get if they configured everything correctly. This helps users confirm if they've achieved their goal. However, we also had another reason why we wanted to include a validate step, and that is for automated tests. Yep, I mentioned in the beginning that we had a way to make sure your how-tos never broke on your users again. So let's talk about automated tests for docs. If you aren't familiar with the docs as test concept, it's that docs are testable assertions about how your product functions. For example, if the docs say you can configure a setting like XYZ, that's something that can be tested to assert that yes, the product can be configured like XYZ and the setting will work. Docs take the work you've done to manually test one step further and ensure that you know about a broken doc before a user finds it. There are many different tools you can use for setting up automated tests for the docs. For example, you can use Cucumber for UI instructions, Dread for API instructions, Playwright for UI steps, and Doc Detective for API, CLI, and UI. The purpose of this talk isn't to convince you to use a certain tool, rather to show you what's possible for automated docs tests. For our automated test, we use a custom in-house tool. When we created our test tool, we knew we wanted to test the docs the way a user would, not test a generated test file. So our test tool pulls up each how-to doc in a headless browser, extracts the code snippets into a test file, runs the copied and pasted code snippets exactly like a user would. Remember how in the demo I copied and ran each step? That is exactly what our automated tests do. They test the doc exactly like a real user. And then finally, our tool uses the validate step to confirm that the output from the test matches the output listed in the how-to. So automated docs tests are super cool, but why should we run them instead of just doing manual tests? Or what benefit do they provide over the tests our development team run on the products? Well, since our docs are real customer workflows, we can use automated tests to catch any product changes, and this includes release changes. Our automated tests ensure that customer workflows never break. Secondly, we can also catch changes on third-party docs since we write those steps out too. We actually had a test fail recently, and when we investigated, it was because the UI of a third-party product had changed, so we were able to update our how-tos before a customer ever reported an issue. But beyond automated tests passing, how do we know that our new how-tos are actually helping users succeed? So, after we rethought and revised our how-tos, how do we know that they hit the mark? How do we know if users were more successful with our updated how-tos than they were before? We have a GitHub action that runs our automated tests at least weekly. This ensures that week to week, our products are working like we say they do, and how-tos won't break on users. Okay, but how do we know these docs won't break after a release? Well, the development teams now run our automated tests alongside their own dev tests with every release. This ensures that our products are functioning exactly like the way a user would use them. But this isn't all. Remember how I said earlier that we wanted to add an AI chatbot, but we couldn't because so many of our docs were incorrect or out of date? Well, now that we manually tested and automated tests of our docs, we finally could add chatbot functionality and get the right answers to users. So, how many correct answers do our docs now provide? 91%. This means that 91% of conversations with our AI chatbot are accurate and answer a user's question. This is even up from 84% when we first reworked our how-tos. Also, we know that the answers users are getting from the chatbot provide value because they report that the answers from AI chat are helpful 81% of the time. So, to recap, when you rethink your how-tos, you'll first want to evaluate how they're currently written and structured. Rewrite them with users' desire to copy and paste down the page. Test the how-to like a user would, from nothing to a completed task. And finally, use automated tests to make sure that your how-tos never break on users again. Thank you for listening to How to Rethink Your How-tos. If you'd like to reach out, you can find me on LinkedIn or the Write the Docs Slack channel. I'm happy to answer any questions you have in QA.